Greetings once again, my intrepid explorers. Once again, this is I, Mr. Bishop, coming at you with Section 2.3, the North Korean invasion of South Korea. And before I dive right back into it, I will tell you just a little tidbit of information. I tried to record the Zoom first half of this presentation, and apparently it did not record. So apparently I get to record the whole thing again. Yay! On top of that, same thing happened to me for 3 Zoom meetings worth of world history. Didn't record any of it. So I recorded the world history program again for 23 minutes and had left my mic muted. So I got to do it a 5th time. So it's very hard to feign excitement over Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. A little easier to get excited about North Korea and the invasion of South Korea. So I'll be a little better, but I'll probably do a whole lot of talking like this to get really excited. That way, you won't be too bored while I'm going into this. As you all know, you've all seen me when I'm tired and I haven't had enough caffeine, or maybe a little too much caffeine. But it's about 9:30 at night, and we're going to get after this for about an hour. Those of you who came to the Zoom meeting can probably skip half of it. The rest of you get to listen to the whole thing, and I'm going to do the whole thing just like this the whole time. I'll even leave my picture up so you can see me do it the whole time. It's going to be awesome. All right, here we go. The key questions. I'm going to go through these pretty quick, mainly because nobody cares about the key questions. To what extent was the outbreak of the Korean War due to Cold War tensions? Clearly, it was totally Cold War tensions, but more on that later. All right. Why did the Chinese become involved, but not the Soviets? Well, I'll tell you later. Moving on. What was the impact of the Korean War on the development of the Cold War? Well, it developed quite a bit. And then it didn't. And then it did. All right, moving on. You can all tell me if this gets really obnoxious, but I'm just going to keep going at it like this for about an hour, so don't worry, it'll be great. The bullet points are important. It's important to know about what a proxy war is. The Korean War was the first proxy war of the Cold War. It was us, of course, fighting the Russians, but pretending that we're not fighting the Russians, and the Russians pretending that they're not fighting us. As it says here in the top left, a proxy war. A war instigated by a major power that does not itself participate. So basically, it means we're pulling the strings but not shooting the people, which isn't exactly true in this case because it's the UN who goes in and fights, and the UN is pretty much entirely the United States Armed Forces. So it really kind of is us, but we're pretending it's not because it's the UN. Or that results when opposing powers use third parties as substitutes for fighting each other directly. Basically, there's a few other examples in this, and I had the Zoom class point some of them out. They mentioned Vietnam, they mentioned Pinochet and such, but the big one that I always like to point out, of course, is the Spanish Civil War, which the Russians and the Germans fight each other to test out their cool new toys that they developed after World War I before World War II sets in, and Germany, of course, realizes that their toys are much better than everybody else's and tries to take over the world. So probably the most famous proxy war is that one. But the Korean War, here we go. The U.S. implements a policing action while the Soviets are boycotting the UN. Soviets quit the UN because they're communists and the UN's not. Was kind of the big thing there. They're going to come back in later, but they're going to hop out at this point, which gives us even more influence. Call the shots for the UN. It's now known that both sides were involved, of course, in the Korean War, but really at the time, both were denying that they were the ones involved there. Right. U.S. thoughts of nuclear war are not wanted against the PRC. Basically, what that means is the United States did not want to nuke China, the People's Republic of China, and it wasn't supported by current politicians to go back to killing civilians. We killed a lot of civilians in Germany. We killed even more in Japan. We didn't want to do that again. That's not what America does. As much as you might like to think that we do, we try not to. Plus, as you can see in this little GIF here, or GIF, or whatever you want to call it, nobody wins. When you have global thermonuclear war, nobody wins, everybody dies. Both these clips are from an amazing movie from the 80s called War Games. It is a brilliant, brilliant movie with Matthew Broderick. It's funny, it's great acting, it's basically about global thermonuclear war. Please, please, please check it out if you can. It's awesome. All right, moving on. Nuclear parity with Russia was a direct deterrent. That happens later. When the Korean War first starts getting ramped up, Russia does not have a nuclear bomb, but we know they're trying to make one. We've talked about the fact that the Rosenbergs gave them the information, and we, of course, took the Rosenbergs to visit Mr. Sparky and lit him up because of it, but we know that the Russians were getting our ability to build nukes. They didn't have them right at the start, but that doesn't mean we wanted to test them either. So here we go. In case you're curious, so that's where Korea is. So that's Japan. Here's what it looks like, all big and pink and green. The Potsdam Declaration. That's talked about in the last video. The idea that we tried to get Japan to quit before nuking them didn't work out. It also declared that within 3 months we would all leave Korea. The problem was that it didn't say how that should occur. So, of course, if we left South Korea, the Russians would take it, and if they left North Korea, we would take it. So, wasn't really sure how we were going to have this nice handoff without fighting war about it. The Russians had been in Korea since early in the 19th century, so through the 1800s, the Russians were there. We talked about them getting concessions at the end of World War II to have a warm water port right here. So the Russians had interest there and didn't want to just leave. Problem was that when Japan pushed them out in 1904, they really hadn't done anything about it since, especially during World War II. Russia, of course, too busy over here in Europe to worry about this. So their claim is kind of outdated at this point. They re-entered North Korea 12th of August, 1945. So that re-entry didn't go very well. As, of course, you know, we're going to talk about this war that doesn't go their way. Here's another re-entry that didn't go Russia's way. This is the re-entry of a Soyuz rocket from space that clearly is not going Russia's way either. But that's a little off topic. Let me move on. All right, Truman's Vision. I'm really just keeping me up there so I can keep myself entertained. I could back up, I could get forward, I could wave my hands at you. I do it in class. I'm going to do it here. I realized that, like, you guys can't much get into my presentations if I can't wave at the camera like a fool. I'm just going to do it. Here we go. All right, Truman's Vision. Truman wanted to create a trusteeship in Korea administered by the UN. Basically, what that means is we were occupying Japan. We had total control of Japan. We were dictators in occupation of a foreign nation, and we didn't want to do that in Korea. So we wanted to hand it off to the UN. Now, of course, we're totally funding the UN. All of the UN soldiers are ours, or the majority of them. But by pretending that the UN is calling the shots, we are not going to be perceived by the world as occupying another nation. So what he wanted was for a 40-year development of Korea's economy, Korea's government, a nice long control by the UN that would establish a functioning government within Korea. The problem for the United States was that our State Department was divided, and I don't mean Republicans and Democrats in Congress. I mean the White House and all of the guys who call the shots at the head of the State Department were having issues. Half of them felt to hold half the peninsula to stop Soviet expansionism. So basically, half wanted to keep the army there to make sure that the Russians and the commies from the north didn't come down and take out the south, and therefore continue the whole domino effect. The other half, and mostly U.S. military, didn't want to be in Korea, right? The military's just fought a huge war, World War II. We've got Japan that they're having to worry about. They've got Germany that they've got occupied, or at least our half. They've got Berlin that they're trying to occupy. So we've got the army is way overstretched. So U.S. military leadership, for once, finally said, "Hey, we don't want to fight this war." So they didn't see Korea as in its sphere of influence, and basically what that means, to make it simple, is there's nothing in Korea we wanted. There aren't minerals there. There isn't a great economy there, at least at the time. Of course, we know now that LG and Samsung and every awesome piece of electronic, TV, computers. I'm looking at my kitchen right now. My refrigerator is LG. My oven is LG. My microwave is LG. I got LG freaking everywhere. My TVs are LG. I love LG, and it all comes out of South Korea. But at the time, they didn't have anything, nothing worth fighting over, or at least having our guys die for. So we wanted to bail. Or at least half our U.S. military wanted to bail. The other half wanted to hold it to stop communism. Anyway, moving on. Feel free to tell me if I'm talking too much and taking too long. Oh, wait. See, to do that, you'd have had to come to the Zoom meeting, and you wouldn't be watching this anyway, so I'm just going to keep talking. All right, here we go. The policymakers win this one. So we stay in the South. The United States, that's policymakers. That's that's this top half guys. Basically, president's cabinet, not U.S. military leadership. Anyhow, policymakers occupy the South. Here they are, aren't they pretty? Stalin acquiesced as well. He ordered the Soviets to stop at the 38th parallel. He did not want the Russians marching into South Korea and starting a war with us. In fact, he wanted to pretend they weren't even there. So I'm going to read this little caption over here. The guy whose last name just happened to be English. I wrote on the print, the 38th parallel, north of Seoul, November 1945. Russian soldiers guarding the border. On a day that we had no assignment, Jack Davis and I drove north from Seoul to the border and took pictures of each other hanging out with the Russians. On a later visit, at another time, the Russians wouldn't let us take any photos. So basically, early in November, they went up there, and like the Russians were just hanging out along the border on their side, and the U.S. were hanging out on our side, and like, hey, look, they took these beautiful pictures. Don't these guys look really happy to be there? Look at them. They're all smiles, right? And then they went back, and the Russian leadership had told them, don't leave evidence or pictures that we are there. The Russians were trying to totally deny that they were there, and that it was really just all in control by the North Koreans. We're not really sure why they were trying to hide the fact they were there. We've got a lot of good evidence, such as they may have feared that large numbers of U.S. forces in the area would decide that the Russians were a threat and do something about it. So they were trying to hide their presence a little bit. They feared atomic power at the time. Stalin, didn't have nuclear weapons yet. So had a war broke out, we could have nuked Moscow, and there's nothing they could have done about it. So Stalin wasn't ready to start a war with a nuclear power. He's not dumb. He feared the U.S. occupation might strike a deal with the Japanese over Korea. So we controlled Japan, right? So if Japan and us decided to get together in on it, Japan and the United States could have decided to attack Korea together in order to push the Russians out. So that's a big threat. He doesn't want that to happen. So what does go on in the North? The Soviets established their own military occupation, obviously, just like we're doing in the South, although we're pretending it's the UN. Koreans developed People's Committee of Communists and Nationalists. Basically, they start to develop the PRC. Um, they organized the distribution of land and food, so just like Castro in Cuba, Mao in China, the Korean communists are doing the same thing. They're trying to establish some land reform, get land and food to the folks. They occupy and organized abandoned Japanese industries. So Japan was there for 100 years, right? They built factories, they built all sorts of stuff. So in the north, they try to start rebuilding some of that. Doesn't work out very well. I mean, clearly we're 100 years later, and you all know what North Korea is like now. So it didn't work out very well. Probably because the dude's grandpa, who's in charge now, is this guy, guerrilla leader Kim Il Sung. He emerges as the communist leader, looks very Mao-esque there to me, in his youth getting after it as a good little communist. He, during World War II, I would like to say hid out, but we'll say he trained in Moscow on how to be a good communist, supported by the Soviets and the Chinese communists in his takeover. And as a nationalist, he was concerned with rebuilding and independence. The Japanese had destroyed most of the infrastructure upon their retreat, so he didn't have uh, governmental offices and such set up to take over. So he's working on that. On the flip side, in the South, we have this lovely gentleman right here. Um, the U.S. is suspicious of the People's Committees, basically because they're communists and we don't want them there. So we start rooting them out in the South. They're pushed out of government. They're not allowed to give a fair say. And as U.S. occupiers, we're kind of okay with that, right? We don't mind not giving communists a fair say. You can decide whether that's right or wrong in your mind, but it's communist. All right, moving on. We supported a guy named Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee had been around for a long time. He was an old man by the time we get to the late 40s. The Americans, as an American educated Korean, he was propped up as the president of the Korean government in exile. So once the Japanese have it totally controlled, he basically pretends to be Korean government, exiled in, oh, look, America, yay. So for about 25 years, he hangs out with us. So when he's brought back, he's kind of out of touch a little bit, totally propped up by us. U.S. kept in place the Japanese government framework, so we kind of keep the same style of government that the Japanese had been doing. And then, of course, as we rebuild Japan's government, we rebuild Korea's as well. Some of those decisions alienated the South. The South see us just as the next group of occupiers. It's a continuation of colonial subjugation. Basically, they've gone from their Japanese overlords to the American overlords. And mainly they see that because we put this doofus in charge. And I'm sure Syngman Rhee was trying to do his best, but he was seen as a brutal authoritarian. The Americans didn't like it, but we put up with it because we needed somebody to take charge and to make sure that the communists who were there weren't able to influence the folks and such. So Truman, again, our American president isn't big on authoritarian dictatorships, but again, we see that as a ballast. Okay, the word ballast, of course, meaning balance against communist expansion. If you have to take out a boxer, the best thing to have is your own boxer hitting back. So that's kind of our idea. Syngman Rhee is using the military to maintain control and not let it slip to the commies. The United States, throughout the late 40s and especially into the 50s, kind of gains a reputation around the world for repeatedly propping up dictators as long as they do business with the United States. So that builds all the way till today of us kind of having this reputation for backing guys that aren't necessarily the best guys to be in business with. Problems in the North and South. The occupation lasts for several years, 45 to 48. There's riots in the north. Basically, they have the same problems they have now as a communist government can't feed its people. China had that problem. Russia had that problem. Cuba had that problem. If you name a communist nation, you're going to name that problem of not being able to feed the folks. Amazingly, it doesn't work. Anyways, I digress. Moving on. Um, Down in the South, they have riots too, and we and Ray blame it on the commies. We say basically every riot that goes against the government is instigated by communist agitators, and that gives us the right to suppress them. Like this lovely picture right here, South Koreans suspected of communist sympathies are imprisoned in South Korea at Busan, all the way through to September 1950. The people get tired of this real quick, right? If you go against the government, you're immediately labeled a dirty commie and rounded up. So whether they're a communist or not, I don't know. But either way, it's not a good way to win over the folks. I'm pretty sure this guy is real happy to be there, though. But everybody else hates it. All right. Neither side, when they say neither side, I mean the Russians or the United States, sees occupying this area of Korea as any sort of benefit. And we're trying to find ways to get out, right? The Russians don't want to be in the north. They've got their own problems to deal with. So they don't want to have the expense of having the military in the north. The United States, same deal. We're occupying Germany. We're occupying Japan. We don't want to be in Korea. And there's nothing there for us. So trying to find a way to get out. And Truman comes up with this great idea. Let's have an election. So as Civil War tensions are growing between the North and the South, especially during this reason, China's having their communist revolution, and Korea is seeing that and going like, oh, we can do that too. So August 1947, Truman proposes elections, and he says we need to have an election for the North and the South. Everybody gets a vote on what they want to do, and we'll roll with it. The thing that Truman has in his favor is he knows the population numbers, and so does the Soviet Union. So the Soviets want to unify Korea. They want a unified Korea that was pro-Soviet, of course, and they refuse because they know the population numbers don't go in their favor. The population in the north is 80 million. The population in the south is 20 million. And very quickly, I'm going to throw out this little link here. If you want to go through the PowerPoint and find it and click on it, you can. But I'm going to show it to you in that Korea's population has always had this split. And you can see on the slider that basically all the way from its creation all the way to today, South Korea has double the population of North Korea. Okay, even today, 25 million for North Korea, 50 million for South Korea. Of course, that has a whole lot to do with the fact that the South Koreans aren't slaughtering their people anymore. They're not a communist dictatorship. They can actually feed their half. They have some of the greatest companies on the planet making all sorts of stuff and all sorts of money. And even if they didn't grow a single kernel of rice in their entire country, I'm pretty sure they've got enough money to import enough food that they're going to be golden. And if North Korea would just figure that out, they too could reap the rewards. But they're in control of a communist dictatorship that likes to have that control and isn't going to give it up. Anyhow, I digress. Moving on. Yeah, I wish this video told me how long I'd been yapping at you. I got no idea. I'm just going to keep going. Here we go. 1948, Stalin proposed that they both withdraw their troops. So in 47, Truman wants a vote. He doesn't get it. In 48, Stalin just says, hey, how about we both just pack up our crap and go home? And, of course, the United States is like, man, we can't do that. Okay, Truman rejects it, turns it all over to the UN, and the UN, starting in 47, says, let's create a commission on Korea. Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. Okay. And he comes up with the idea that, we need a supervised unification. And then we need to select a government. Well, okay, good, UN. We figured that out 5 years ago. So the UN then says, we need an election. Awesome, UN. Amazing, you're thinking just like the United States because you're controlled by the United States. So we're going to have that election no later than March of 1948. And we're going to administer it by the UN to make sure it's all on the up and up. Great, thanks. Here's some pictures of them doing it. The Soviets, of course, say, we're not doing that. Not only are we not doing that, we're not letting the UN come into the North and have any part of that. So take a hike. So the UN does carry out the vote in the South on May of 1948, even though they had said, we're not going to have that vote any later than March of 48. But we have it in May. It's kind of like wanting to go to Europe in March of 2020 and being told that you can't go until May of 2020. Wait, strike that. We're the district. You can't go until June. Wait, no, strike that again. You cannot travel in June either. Maybe you can go in August. We really don't feel comfortable saying that you can go in August, so we're just going to say you can't go in August either. So you can't travel to Europe with your group that you fully paid for at $5,000 a person until spring break of 2021, and even that's kind of touch and go. We'll see. I digress. Let's get back to the point. All right, UN carries out that vote in 1948. Under the UN, it supervises a free election, and amazingly enough, the guy that the UN and the United States control wins. I'm sure it's just a coincidence and good for our part. Ray was elected, and he leads the Republic of Korea. Yay for him. The UN then recognizes the Republic of Korea, meaning South Korea, as a new country. It's going to then be immediately offered a new membership and the newest member of the UN. Yay! So the US then starts making plans to withdraw forces. Good for them. In the North, they're basically going to do the same thing, but commie style. September 1948, Democratic People's Republic is formed. Kim Il-sung, of course, gets to be head of state, and that's why we have his grandson as the current leader. And look, they all look exactly the same. Maybe he, like his grandson, just randomly picks up blocks of cheese and eats it like a candy bar. You can find pictures of that online. It's awesome. Anyways, Stalin withdraws forces December 1948. He beats the U.S. to it. The U.S. announces it first and then slow rolls out our withdrawal. The Russians basically just say, all right, they're a country now and we're out, and they pack up. This is significant because everything that happens between the United States and Russia in the Cold War is noteworthy. It's all a constant chess game. And by the Russians pulling out, it says, number one, they're confident in North Korea's ability to defend itself, but also they're saying that, like, hey, the U.S. said they'd pull out, and they didn't, and off we go. So it's all about brinkmanship and kind of one-upping each other. So by the Russians pulling out first, they're kind of saying, oh, we win this one. We could set up our country faster. So North Korea does, of course, maintain close ties to the Soviet Union, giving it a stable regime, basically making Russia their overlords and under their umbrella. So by the end of 1948, here's what the world looks like. China's up here. Russia's right here next door in case anything happens. You got Japan down here, so that's us. And, of course, this is all UN, which is us. So here we are in 1948. Yay, everybody's going to be happy. Korea is both legally and politically divided. It is two separate nations. Oh, fake tea. Good. Moving on. Unification, no longer possible. It's not going to be possible until they start shooting each other, right? So, two separate nations. Occupation forces withdrawing on both sides meant an independent civil war may be possible and was clearly probable. Had we actually gone away and the Russians actually gone away, the two Koreas could have fought it out. North Korea would have won this thing. I'm going to explain why in a moment. But clearly North Korea would have won. That is why we slow rolled our withdrawal and waited for all the Russians to leave, and then we kind of just didn't leave. But we kind of did, and kind of didn't, kind of did, kind of didn't, and it's the UN. Anyhow, causes of the North Korean invasion of South Korea. Here we go. Prior to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, we believed that the Soviet Union was pushing Kim Il-sung to invade the South. We believed that Russia was pulling his strings and really behind the war, and that the war was a product of Soviet aggression, okay, pushing the dominoes, right, trying to expand communism. Okay? Once this fell, or once the Soviet Union fell, and we started getting some of those documents, those top secret documents that they wouldn't release before, we started to get the idea that Russians didn't want another war. They were in no position to fight when they didn't have the money. They were occupying Germany, all the things I just talked about. So they didn't want this war. So it was pushed by Kim and the North Koreans wanting to reunite their country. Okay, think of the American Civil War, right? That war was pushed by the North and its leadership, i.e., Abe Lincoln, refusing to let states leave when they didn't want to be part of it anymore. So I know there's a whole lot more to it in slavery and all that, but basically the war was pushed by the North. The South just wanted out. Um, and the North came down. So it's the same thing here. The North wanted to reunify the country, and the South just wanted out. Leave us the heck alone. We don't want to be frickin' commies. Um, so um, they weren't strong enough to do it alone. The North knew they needed help. They knew they needed guns and ammo and such. They knew that the Japanese had burned all their factories and stuff. So Kim kept pushing, kept lobbying Stalin to aid the invasion and help. He wanted to get it started in early of '49, so he wanted to get it done like now. The DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Once again, that whole idea that every non-Republican country on the planet has to call itself a republic. It's what they do. So the DPRK army outnumbered the South Korean army. 135,000 in the north, 98,000 in the south. They had the bigger army. They needed the guns to supply it. And then they knew they could win this war. If they could just get the supplies they needed, they could wrap this whole thing up, especially if the Americans left. So there they are in all their glory, ready to go put boot to butt. They lacked the proper weaponry, as I was saying. They knew about the discrepancy in population as well. If the South got its act together with double the population, clearly they could double their army size, and they knew that that would be a problem. So basically, it's the we have to go kill them now, or they'll be too big to do it later, was what Kim kept arguing. Stalin refused to do it. He knew the UN was controlled by the United States. He needed to wait until they had reliable nuclear technology before he could then go and authorize any sort of war that might push him into a fight with the United States. Also, it would keep the United States out of it. So once Kim did go in and fight, if the United States and Russia didn't want to get into a nuclear battle, it would give us both an excuse to stay out. So either way you look at it, they're not ready. All right, so the South does share some of the responsibility of starting this war. They don't march across the line, but they do kind of cause it a little bit. So here we go. Ray also pushes for reunification, talks about it on the radio and TV and everything else. He wants U.S. support to go into the North. He wanted the U.S. to stay in South Korea for protection against the Soviets and Chinese communists. Basically, he wants the U.S. to stick around and keep purging communists from South Korea so that he can stay in power. Needs us around. He's corrupt. The people don't really like him. He's a dictator who does terrible things to people. So he needs us there to keep propping him up. The U.S. was less willing. We really don't like to occupy foreign nations unless there's something in it for us. Like clearly when we occupied Cuba and we occupied the Dominican Republic and we occupied other places like the Philippines and Guam and Hawaii and everything else we do. But there's always money in it for us. Yes, it's expensive to send our military in there, but we send in U.S. companies afterwards and they grow all sorts of cool stuff like cigars and sugarcane and fruits and vegetables and all sorts of cool stuff. We're not doing that in Korea. We're just losing money. So anyways, here we go. U.S. was less willing to stick around. And we don't want to fight the Russians either because they crazy. And by crazy, I mean like, Napoleon style. They'll burn down their own cities to make sure that the army attacking can't scavenge for food and can't find shelter. Okay, they will put up guns behind their own army and shoot them if they try to retreat. I mean, the Russians are crazy. Don't fight the Russians ever. The Russians are in their weakest position now, I believe, than they have ever been on this planet. And I still don't want to fight the Russians. Just leave them alone. All right, totally off topic again, but here we go. All right, American National Security Council Edict, April 1950. All right. It stated that the United States needed to stockpile substantial armed forces to prevent Soviet expansion. Okay, so here we are. We're stockpiling weapons in case there's a war with Russia, which means we don't think we're ready to fight the Russians because we haven't stockpiled anything yet. In this document, the secret document argued the Soviets were making aggressive moves in Europe and Asia, and the U.S. needed to be prepared for potential armed conflict. Today is, I'm going to look at my watch. What is today's date? Today's date is 3/31/2020. The president gave a speech today on the coronavirus, but in it, he mentions that we had a broken system of hospitals and bad regulations and ill preparedness, and we didn't have ventilators, we didn't have medicine, we didn't have all of this. And he's saying that he inherited that bad program. He doesn't blame Obama. He says every president before him did not prepare for a potential plague to hit the world. So what he also said, though, is when I came into president, we didn't have bullets for our army. And what he means by that is the arms budget had been so cut by previous Democratic presidencies is that he refunded the army and they bought a bunch of bullets and they're buying bullets for a possible war. I don't think we're going to go to war with anybody anytime real soon, hopefully, but that's the way our president currently thinks, and that's exactly what this is getting at. Okay, we felt we were not prepared to fight the Russians, even though we had nuclear weapons, and even once they get them, we still have way more than them. So, but we're stockpiling weapons. Other things that we consider: Truman wanted to end Japanese occupation. Okay, it was costing us $2 billion from 1946 to 49. Now, granted, $2 billion means nothing to you at this point because we just signed a document that's going to give like $6 trillion to the American people because of this whole virus thing. But at the time, costing us $2 billion to sit in Japan was a lot, and we didn't want to keep doing that in Korea. So the U.S. kind of wavers on that stance of we have to get the heck out now. With this guy, Dean Acheson, I'll mention him in just a second, but the United States wanted to support democracy in South Korea, but feared Ray's aggression towards North Korea. So we're trying to hold to the idea that it's democracy and that we're having these kind of real elections with Ray being elected, but pretty shaky. So the U.S. gives $150 million to economically stabilize the government and support Ray's leadership. So, if he didn't have money to keep the army going and keep the economy going, then it would all fall apart, of course, and South Korea would have its own little civil war. So we're propping up their economy to keep that all kind of chugging along. In 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, as I mentioned there in both pictures, he lays out a very, very famous speech in 1950 called the Pacific Perimeter Speech. And I will show you the Pacific Perimeter here in just a moment. There it is, the Pacific Perimeter. And in that speech, he basically says the United States' defense perimeter includes the Aleutian Chain of Alaska, the Philippines, Japan, and Okinawa. What that basically means is that if you draw this line and you continue up and touch Alaska, and you come back down over here in the Philippines, the heck with Malaysia apparently, and you come back across here and you've got all these islands in the middle, and you come across to Hawaii and the U.S.-held islands of Palmyra and was this Kingman, and you draw your line back to the United States over here, we basically say this entire ocean is ours because Japan is ours at that time. So the only kind of water that China can have is this little bit right in here, and Russia can have this little bit here, and we get the entire ocean. It's ours. And it doesn't mean they can't go into it. It just means that we're going to control any regulations and what goes on there. But the problem is, at the time, we were occupying South Korea, and Dean Acheson makes the United States' official position is that we're not defending Korea. So he mentions not Korea, and he never goes back and corrects it, which also means that it becomes the U.S. official position. We start to withdraw troops, 1949. Soviet intelligence reports the U.S. was wary of supporting Ray, so Russia starts telling North Korea, as well as the world, that the United States is not supporting Ray like it used to. Okay? Stalin then decides it's time to stop stalling. So Stalin still decides, deciding when approached by Kim, he's still deciding. What I mean, he's like still deciding, like, do I want this war to happen? Do I want to risk my guys and my money to fight it? So while that's going on, Kim comes to him with several ideas. Here we go. Number one, he believes the South wants his rule. Okay? Kim's the kind of guy who believes that everybody loves him. He's, I would not say delusional, but just self-aggrandizing in that he believes that the South will support him if they do march in. He believed the South wanted to be part of the communist nation. There were communists in the South being purged, so he knew that there was some support for the Communist Party in the South. He approached Mao as well as Stalin. Mao, of course, up to 49, is fighting his own war. So he's got to kind of wait for the communist revolution in China to get over. So Mao agreed that unification was only possible with military action. So Mao's a smart guy. He knows how communist takeovers work. He was doing it himself. So without the United States, South Korea was weak and poorly armed, of course. So Stalin believed the United States, after not including Korea in its Pacific perimeter, would not intervene. Kind of a foolish thought, but Stalin believed that we cut them out and we were giving it to whatever. We were throwing them to the wolves, basically. So number one, Stalin authorizes the attack in April of 1950. Authorizes. That does not mean gets in on. Just says okay. He gives his official fatherly thumbs up to it. Yay. 25 June 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. There's the lovely document. Communist troops from North Korea invade U.S.-sponsored South Korea. Notice it says U.S.-sponsored. It means we set it up. It doesn't mean that we are there. 27 June, North Korea controls most of the peninsula. It only takes 2 days. It's kind of a small country. But they take Seoul. Seoul is only 10 miles from that middle line of Korea. So they basically take over the whole peninsula. There's a little chunk in the south that the UN still holds. United Nations Security Council votes June 27, 1950. The vote goes 9-0 to take action against North Korea. 15 countries respond with soldiers. The majority, of course, are the United States. Everybody else is there just to go along with us. Acheson thought that the invasion of South Korea was a head fake by the Russians. Basically, Acheson is afraid of the domino effect, right? You got McCarthy, you got everybody screaming about the commies. All that's about to happen in the 60s and get crazy. So we're leading up to that. That fear of the Russians is still there in the 50s. So Acheson thinks that if the United States gets bogged down in the war in Korea, where we're fighting communist Chinese and Russians, that then the Russians can expand elsewhere and we'll have no position to do it. Will they expand more in Germany? Will they expand into Afghanistan and the Mideast like they eventually do? All of that. And we'd be in no position to stop them because we've got to fight millions and millions and millions of Chinese in Korea as a proxy war. So there's a lot of fear there for the United States. It's all being pushed by this guy, and he's not necessarily wrong at the time to have those fears, because Russia does expand across Europe, and we'll get to that. So there it is, meant to take our eyes off of the Soviet expansionism in Europe, and we'll get to that when we get into their control of Poland and Romania and all of that. All right, so UN ensured the U.S. involvement by giving command to U.S. military and civilian officials. Basically, the UN votes to get in on the war, and then the UN immediately votes to say, okay, United Generals are in control of everything. You get to call the shots. Since it's all our guys and all our money, we probably should be calling the shots. So that, of course, draws in more U.S. military because we like our guys and we know how to use our guys and our machinery and such and not have to command foreign troops. All right, and of course, it's going to be led by this guy. Yay for this guy. This guy is awesome. Okay, he was an officer and a gentleman in World War I. He fought on the front lines. He was an officer and a gentleman in World War II. He didn't necessarily fight on the front lines, but he controlled a huge part of the war, especially in the Pacific. And then, of course, he is the guy in control of Japan while he's basically, presiding over our occupation there. And so when Korea comes up, he's ready to step in. So MacArthur comes in, starts kicking some serious, risky plans. He doesn't want to just attack from the south where we have a small foothold. He wants to show immediate aggression. In the early 90s, the Americans use a term called shock and awe. Basically, that's what he wants to do. He wants to hit them from everywhere and show them just how BA we are and that they should have never messed with us. All right, so he goes into an amphibious attack at Incheon. He's not afraid of amphibious attacks. He's been doing it all across the Pacific in World War II. He knows it's bloody, but it also is the way you put boot to ass. So here is Douglas MacArthur. He is flanked by Matthew Ridgway. This guy, he'll become important in a minute. And Earl Partridge, this guy. Earl Partridge, as you can see, is always MacArthur's, he's standing on his right-hand man. He is a 3-star general in his own right. He is smart, he is intelligent, but he is always there. He's like the Vice President, Mike Pence, who's always constantly saying, our president is such a great man, and his great leadership is what's going to get us through this, blah, blah, blah. That's this guy. And again, it's not to play down this guy's role, but he's always subordinate to him. But he's there to help him too, right? Give good suggestions, etc. Smart generals surround themselves by other smart generals. Anyways, here we go. So not only did he free South Korea, but UN forces chased the North Korean army all the way to the Chinese border by October of 1950. And this is what's going to cause a rub between MacArthur and Truman. MacArthur did not want to stop going north. He wanted to go straight in and put boot to ass to the Chinese. He wanted to start a war with China and end Chinese communism. So he's correct in the idea that he's fighting the Chinese more than he's fighting the North Koreans. So he wants to just keep on going. He's fighting the Chinese anyways. The problem is if he does that, we can't stop pretending on the worldwide stage that this is a war between the South Koreans and the UN and the North Koreans. If the United States pushes into China, then we have to openly admit that it's us doing it because the UN wouldn't have authorized it. So it would be us versus the Chinese. And as much as we'd like to think we could nuke them into the Stone Ages, fighting 300 million Chinese or however many millions of Chinese they had at the time would have been terrible, right? We don't have enough bullets now to shoot the billion of them that there are. So I'm sure we didn't have enough to shoot the hundreds of millions that were back then. Anyways, I digress. I'm mumbling on because it's like 10:15 and I've been up all day and doing this for like the third time. But here we go. All right. All right, get back forward. Many argue that the United States should have stopped at the 38th parallel. We should have stopped in South Korea is probably absolutely correct. Okay, why did we march up through the north? Were we going to keep it? We didn't fight very hard for it, and we didn't supply it enough to keep it, so why didn't we just free South Korea, which was an independent nation propped up by us? So why didn't we just stay there? Because MacArthur wanted to put boot to ass and did. So MacArthur, however, wanted to go even further. He wanted to preemptively attack the Chinese army to undermine the new communist regime there as well. So he wanted to keep going. So he is the one who marched into North Korea, but we got him stopped before he went into China and really started some damage. Truman and Atchison ordered this to not occur. Truman and Atchison overrides McCarthy and tells everybody so that McCarthy can't double cross him that under no circumstances are you to go into freaking China, man. Don't do it. It's bad. Alrighty. So, consequences of Chinese involvement. Of course, the Chinese were involved because the Russians didn't. Um, so, do something about your child, madam. It's a war, it's a war, it's a war, and I'll nuke you both. This is a more modern political cartoon, but it gets to the same point. The United States is protecting North Korea like it's a little child, and it doesn't matter if this is the first Sung or the third Kim. I don't even care. It's the same thing. They're saying we're going to nuke you and we're going to fight you, and America really just constantly talks over their head to China because China's really the one in charge, and we let these two babies fight it out. South Korea not aggressive, just gonna kind of hide behind our protection. Anyways, Kim Kim begs Stalin for help. Please, please, please send your forces. I need them. Because he's been totally overrun by the UN and the Americans. Stalin is unwilling to engage directly. He's unwilling to send Russian forces. There's no way to hide Russian forces because they speak Russian, and when you have Russians get captured in South Korea, we would have told the entire planet. We would have wanted the whole planet to turn on Russia, right? If you remember the end of World War II, Patton, one of the reasons Patton gets taken out of his leadership for like the third time is because he wanted to march straight through Germany and attack Russia. He wanted to rearm the Germans against the Russians. Okay, so he's not the only one, right? Patton is friends with McCarthy. They both want to go kick butt on every commie on the freaking planet and just wipe them out, wave a big banner that says kill them all and let God sort them out. So that's the way those guys think. Stalin knows that's the way they think because they're not quiet about it. And he's not willing to do it. So Stalin tells the Chinese, hey, how about you go in there? The United States had kind of helped you out in the war, and maybe they won't want to fight you. So the Communist Chinese set up the Communist Volunteer Army Corps, created October 1950, and they throw 300,000 troops at it. And they mobilize. Here they are, aren't they pretty? Surprised by this development, the UN were pushed back out of the DPRK. So, as awesome as we are, we didn't want to fight the entire Chinese army, so we end up getting pushed back. We do take heavy losses. I've had family in the Korean War. It was terrible. Lots of them very disappointed, just like our Vietnam veterans were disappointed about the fact that they went over there, they lost brothers for the Americans just to kind of give up. They saw like, hey, we freaking won. We've got the country. Just give us the resources we need to hold it. And the UN was like, nah, we're not going to do that. So they get pushed back. January 1951, the UN, supported again by us, does have a technological advantage. We had better planes, better bombs, better tanks, better everything. So by the time we get it there, it was our advantage was established, and the Chinese army was forced to retreat from South Korea. So basically, the war goes like this: the North Koreans march down before we're ready to respond, and then we send in MacArthur, and he marches all the way up to the Chinese border, and then the Chinese get involved and push us all the way back down past the midline, and they get halfway through South Korea. The UN and America sends a whole bunch of stuff back in there, and we push them back to the 38th parallel. And this time we're like, yeah, we'll just stop here. This is good. All right. So the UN technology has superiority versus the Chinese numerical advantage. So it's kind of a draw. It's a draw because the United States won't commit the full forces of the United States Army and fight it as an open war. But so the UN, with its technological superiority, comes to a stalemate with the numbers of the Chinese that are there. Mao, wanting to show communist strength, guaranteed unlimited volunteer forces. And when Mao goes on his own national radio and such and tells the entire planet that he will send North Korea as many soldiers as they ever need, and they're the biggest population on the planet even then. That's a whole lot of people for us to have to try to kill. So we decide, maybe that's not such a good idea. So unlimited volunteer forces coming out of China. MacArthur says, nuke them. Just nuke them and be done with it. They don't have nukes. You can decide for yourself if nuking a billion Chinese is a good idea or not. You decide what side you want to be on. Truman, of course, was adamantly against this. Like, hey, we might not like the Chinese, but let's not nuke, a several 100 million civilians. Maybe all the civilians aren't bad. Maybe we don't have to hate them all. So thus, you get books like this, which I highly recommend you read. This is a very good read, talking about the difference between the power of a general who is the most popular person in America versus a president who was popular enough, but also only got his job because the previous president died. And, is he a real president? Yes, he gets reelected, blah, blah, blah. But so it's a good book. I recommend you read it. This little caption up here, top left. The American general in charge in Korea, Douglas MacArthur, was sacked by President Truman because he not only wanted to free South Korea, but wanted to remove the communists from North Korea and then carry the fight on into China. He even asked for permission to use nuclear weapons. He's going to get fired and pulled out because not only does he tell the president what he wants to do, but he also goes public with it. And a general, no matter how much they disagree with a president, should never talk out of turn from the head general on the planet, which is, of course, the president of the United States. So no matter how good he is, he has to be removed. Truman, in one of my most famous lines ever, which I know I've used before, give him hell, Harry Truman, for the nickname he gets coming out of World War II. I fired MacArthur because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the rules for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail. So Truman doesn't hold any punches. In his opinion of MacArthur, but he's just pissed off because MacArthur spoke out against him, and of course generals aren't supposed to do that. So here we go. Truman was adamantly against going at it against the Chinese directly, feared the Soviets would then retaliate with their own nukes, which had become available by the early 50s. And all the nukes were over on the Europe side, so he couldn't send nukes to Korea. But he could definitely hit us in Germany. He could definitely, fly planes far enough to hit Paris and London and anywhere else he dang well wanted. And of course, at the time, our technology could not have knocked them out of the air, could not have knocked the Russian planes out of the air, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just much too much of a risk for us to openly go to war with the Russians. At the time, by the 50s, it's just us and Russia as the nuclear players. That, of course, is going to get way more complicated when we get to today. MacArthur was extremely vocal about his disagreement with government decisions. That's not good for generals to do. Even after his orders, he was given orders to restrict public comments. Basically, the president says, hey, I really like you as a general. You're really good, but just shut the heck up. And he doesn't, so he's out. Kept arguing for that direct attack on mainland China. He wanted to frickin' amphibious assault China. Craziness. So I don't know if the dude's just been in war too long and that's all he could see was red, but red because the communists are red. This guy's funny. He didn't even know it. Moving on. All right. April 1951. He was relieved of command, and as I pointed out Ridgway before, he is replaced by Ridgway. Ridgway is totally a yes man. It's not that Ridgway isn't good. He's got submarines and boats and everything else named after him. Ridgway was good at what he did, but notice how he's dressed. Dude's like the pretty boy general. Like, he's clean cut. He's do it by the book guy. He's follow command guy. This is MacArthur's right-hand man who stays on to assist Ridgway. but not even close to the same like relationship and helping each other out. Ridgway's the guy from April 51 on. Battle lines settled in at the 38th. The United States agreed to not invade North Korea again. They set up a defensive position, which is still there today. There is a ceasefire that is called to discuss kind of ending the conflict. The ceasefire still exists today. Technically, they're still at war, but not shooting each other. There've been discussions of actually calling an end to the war, but neither side wants to really openly admit that they're never going to reunite as one country. So I could be wrong, but as far as I can think, I've not seen anything that says that war's fully over. So they're still in a ceasefire as far as I know. From 51 to 53, there are sporadic battles back and forth across the 38th, but nothing major, no major invasions, etc. The main point of contention from this point on was the exchange of POWs. And amazingly enough, even back then, the US and UN wanted volunteer repatriation for those who wanted to return. Basically, what that means is when we release prisoners, when we release North Korean prisoners, the Chinese and the North Koreans said, you got to send them all back. You got to send them all, put them on a truck, and give us them all back. And the UN said, nah, man, we don't want to force them. They don't want to go. Okay, North Korean soldiers who got captured were like, sweet, I'll stay in the South. I'm away from the generals who will shoot me for not shooting at you. But now that I'm already here, I'm not going back. You can't make me. They don't feed us up there. And when they throw rice at us, we got to pick it out of the dirt one at a time. I ain't doing it. All right. After all of this, what about Russia? We're almost done, I think. I don't know. Could go on forever. Here we go. All right. Absent from all negotiations. Do I talk like this in class? I don't know. Maybe I do. Anyways, Russia. Russia is cut out of all negotiations. They didn't want to formally be involved in the fight, so they don't get to formally be involved in the peacekeeping. They are there. Here's some pictures. 1951, Korea, Soviet MiGs curving around for attack against USAF B-29s. B-29s being our bombers. And Soviet MiGs did attack us. At the time, nobody talked about it. Okay, these pictures were not released at the time. They were classified by both us and the Russians, who had pictures of us fighting each other. So we're fighting a proxy war just like the Spanish Civil War, except we're hiding it because we're testing their planes and they're testing ours, and we want to do that, but we can't let the public know because then we have to fight a real war. So there it is. It's known to officials that Russian pilots are engaging Americans, but nobody really does anything about it. It's the same thing we have in Alaska here all the time, where Russian bombers fly into American airspace near Alaska, not over Alaska, but near it along the coast, and we scramble our fighters and we send 10 of the most awesome planes that we have. I just spaced the name of it. If I could ask you, I'm sure you all. The Raptor, the F-30 something. Anyways, whatever. But they do that to see how quickly we can get out there to them, how many planes we send out, how fast those planes get there, et cetera, what kind of formation we come in. Do they come from Fairbanks or Anchorage or whatever? And they do it all the time. I mean, they do it like once every 2 months. They do it so often that the news only reports it about once or twice a year because it's just not news anymore. But again, they're doing that to test us out. And so they were doing it back then, they're doing it now. Stalin refused to accept communist defeat in Korea. Meh, good for Stalin. Accept it, don't accept it. It ain't happening in South Korea. Sorry, dude. So on his death in March of 1953, this is actually kind of important for us. He's not there to push the Russians to be involved in Korea anymore. So the Russians, after he dies, they're like, we're out, man. We don't care about Korea. Screw them. So they kind of move on. The power struggles in Russia decide not to include Korea. They got way too much to handle with the problems that are going to come up with Central Europe, what we call the Soviet satellite countries like Belarus, Poland, Romania, et cetera, et cetera. So they got much bigger fish to fry than worrying about Korea way on the other side of the nation. So there it is. It's not crucial to Russian power. On our side, we're going to elect Eisenhower. Thanks, Ike. Ike, of course, seen as the guy who wins World War II for us, especially on the Europe side. He's also involved in the Pacific, but not as much. Anyways, Eisenhower gets elected by claiming he's going to get us out of Korea. Okay, that's his big push. I'm going to get us out of Korea. It's the way Trump said and Obama have both said, oh, I'm going to get us out of Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're going to stop that thing, but we're still doing that thing, and we pulled back, and now we're sending more because we pulled back too early. Anyways, Eisenhower says, we're getting out. I promise. I pinky swear. Thus, both countries now have people in charge who don't want to fight in Korea, right? So Truman and Stalin were keeping us there. Ike and the guy who takes over for Russia don't want it. They don't do it. I'm just going to show you this little political ad. This is awesome. I'm pulling for Ike. What a great political ad. Also, there's a lot of buttons that go out. I don't think I have a picture of it, but they just say, I like Ike. Kind of a whimsical little thing. All right. This one's even better. Let's clean house with Ike and Dick. I don't want to clean house with Dick. It just doesn't sound right to me. I don't want to be inappropriate. I just, and the fact that when Dick becomes president, he then, of course, gets the moniker Tricky Dick because he's kind of a sleazeball and he's slimy and he does all sorts of backroom deals and stuff because he's Tricky Dick. But that was his vice president, who, of course, is going to become president after. 27 July 1953, the UN, North Korea, and China all sign a ceasefire and agreed to basically the line they had before the war even started. So we're all back at the 38th parallel. Yay for us. We're going to stare at each other across it for the next 60 years, and we're still staring at across it. In 2000, straight up the year 2000, I was in college, and the guy who lived in the dorm room next to me was a U.S. soldier who had done his 4 years and then come to college, and he spent 2 of his years standing in a room staring across the border. So we're still doing it. We're still there. Nothing's really changed. So only South Korea refused to sign the ceasefire, but nobody cared that South Korea didn't sign it because the UN, backed by us, and China did sign it. So it's not like North Korea or South Korea could fight the war on their own. And there you have it. All right, so some impacts. We're just about done, I promise. I got some dust on my screen. Let me wipe that off. Impacts of North Korean invasion on South Korea. The first major Cold War conflict. Yay! Cold War is going to go on, of course, for quite a while longer, all the way up into, most people say, the 80s, fall of Russia, 89. So we got a long way to go, but this is the first big one. And the biggest part of it is this right here. No nukes. The paramount thing to take away from the North Korean War is that we can fight wars, we can own nuclear weapons, and we can choose not to use them. Yay! We all don't die because I can go all the way back to that clip of thermonuclear war, and everybody dies. There's no winner in that. So nuclear weapons are kept off the table. The Soviet neutrality, at least officially, aided in keeping the Cold War contained. By pretending that the United States wasn't pulling the strings in South Korea and that Russia wasn't pulling the strings in North Korea, we didn't have to openly fight each other and make a big worldwide war out of it. Nobody wanted that. Okay, millions and millions and millions of people died in the World War II, and like, what are we talking about? 5 years later, we're going to do it again? No, we're not doing that. We need to stay home and breed and rebuild our numbers and such. Yeah, the U.S. sees Korea as a containment success. Yay for the Americans! We fought a war to the same line we started at. yay for us, it's a win, because they were the invaders, remember? So it's a win for us. It stops Soviet expansion. We thought Soviet expansion, but definitely communist expansion in Asia. We'll see how it goes for the rest of Soviet expansion as we get into the 60s and 70s, but we'll get there, hopefully, depending on how this whole distance learning thing goes. All right, the United States. People now see clear proof of communist worldwide collusion and took actions to prevent it. Again, ramping up into McCarthyism and all of that, the United States sees that what they saw as the dirty commies were getting into other countries and causing wars. And we started pushing the UN and everything else, and people got really scared. This is what pushes the Red Scare, is this big war. We see that the Chinese aren't going to stay out of it. So if the Russians and the Chinese team up, that's a huge scare. You got the most populous country on the world tied to a country that now has nuclear weapons. That's pretty scary. So yeah, we were freaking out. This is the world that I was born into, right? In the late 80s, everybody's afraid of the Russians. Every movie was about the dirty Russians, et cetera, et cetera. Stopping communists is everybody's job. I still love the hammer and sickle. I know it's, a symbolism of torture and whatnot, but it's just a powerful signal. Anyways, moving on. All right, the rearmament of West Germany and eventually NATO membership. Yeah, we're going to get into that next time. I'm not even going to talk about it. Moving on. Basically, what this means, though, is that we've got bigger fish to fry. The CIA establishes a lot of work in Western Europe, lots of covert operations. It's kind of where the CIA gets its start, is at the end of World War II. Basically tracking communist movement on those satellite and border nations with the rest of Europe, making sure that they're not like bringing communists into, Germany, Italy, France, those areas. We really don't want them turning commie while we're not paying attention. So the CIA is there to kind of keep the lid on all that. Communist unity. Is there really communist unity? We like to think so. The Koreans shaking hands with Castro here. You've got them all lined up in these cool pictures, but were they really on each other's side? Not so much, not nearly as much as we thought. China and Russia wanted to project unity to the world, and they did so very successfully. But really on the inside, the Russians weren't helping them out. Stalin dies. China is left pretty much abandoned. They don't get any money or help from the Russians, and as we've talked about before, this is why they end up trying that whole Great Leap Forward and killing 40 million people with everything that they did there. So they pretty much split ties within the decade. Korea is still divided on ideological lines with the same tensions, keeping them separate, except now, of course, North Korea has nukes. I can honestly tell you I have not researched like when North Korea got nukes and how. I just know that they have them. So that's really the only reason why we let North Korea and its crazy leader do what they do, is that they could nuke Seoul. And if they nuke Seoul, that kills 10 million people in an instant. That's really their only power. It's the only reason we let them do what they do. So lots of people thought that Trump was going to force us into a war with Korea. Nice that he proved to not be that crazy. There it is, Seoul's population, 10.1 million. 35 miles from the demilitarized zone. And thus you have the end of this lovely presentation. I hope you were at least mildly entertained looking at me and my spastic, sleep-deprived self. If you got any questions, email me. I'll hit you up with an assignment tomorrow after I go and get some sleep. You guys are awesome. I actually do enjoy doing this. I miss doing it in front of a live audience. I'm not going to ramble anymore, but peace. Cheers. See you later.